A massive body launched across a television stage. The floor shook when his boots hit the boards. He came fast for a man that size, arms out, aiming to crush the smaller man against the wall. The audience gasped. Someone screamed. A dog barked once, sharp and low, from the edge of the lights. Then the small man moved. Nobody in that studio saw what happened. 1 second the giant was charging. The next second the giant was on his knees, gasping, one arm bent behind him at an angle that arms are not built to hold. The cameras nearly missed it. The audience went dead silent. Not a single clap, not a single word. The man who did this was 29 years old and his name was Bruce Lee. What happened in the next 90 seconds ended a television show for good. Stay with me on this one. Now let me take you back a few hours because none of this was supposed to happen. The show was called Kellerman After Dark. It ran live late at night out of a studio in Burbank. And the man whose name was on the door, Barry Kellerman, was in trouble, not that he'd admit it. He was the kind of man who smiled wide and talked loud and never once let you see the sweat. But the numbers were bad. The network had sent him a letter 2 weeks earlier. Polite words on top, a warning underneath. Ratings up by the end of the month or the show goes dark. Kellerman read that letter twice, then dropped it in the trash and told his producer they'd fix it with a stunt. A big one. Something people would talk about at work the next day. Here's the thing about Kellerman. He was funny, sure, quick with a joke. But underneath the charm, he had a mean streak. He liked to bring people on his show and needle them, make them squirm a little for the laugh. The audience ate it up, and that was the whole game to him. Make somebody smaller so the room feels bigger. So when his booker mentioned a young martial arts teacher out of Chinatown, a fellow starting to get some buzz around town, Kellerman leaned back in his chair and got an idea. Not a good idea, a cruel one. He'd invite this Bruce Lee onto the show for a friendly demonstration. Let him do his little karate moves, and then Kellerman would spring a surprise. He'd bring out a real man, a giant, and he'd watch the tough guy from Chinatown fold up like a lawn chair on live television. The giant's name was Vince Draska. They called him the Mountain. He'd wrestled professionally for years, 350 pounds, a neck like a fire hydrant, hands that could palm a basketball in each. He'd broken a man's jaw in a bar once and paid a fine and gone home to sleep like a baby. Kellerman paid him $200 in cash and told him the plan. Come out mad, rough the little guy up, make it look real, give the folks at home a scare. Draska took the money, cracked his knuckles, and grinned. He liked scaring people. He liked it a lot. Now here's what neither of them knew. Bruce Lee was not some hobbyist doing tricks. He'd been fighting since he was a boy. Real fights on rooftops in alleys before he ever taught a lesson. He'd rebuilt fighting from the ground up because the old ways were too slow for him. His hands were faster than most men could follow, and he'd spent his whole life being underestimated. Small, foreign, young. He knew that look. He'd seen it on 1,000 faces, and he'd learned a long time ago to let people think whatever they wanted, right up until the moment it stopped being safe for them to think it. Bruce arrived at the studio a little after 9 that night. He came in through the back, and he did not come alone. Walking beside him, off-leash, calm as a Sunday morning, was a big German shepherd named Bodhi. Dark coat, upright ears, eyes that never stopped moving. Bruce had raised that dog from a pup. They went everywhere together. And that dog watched over Bruce the way a good dog watches over the one person it loves in the whole world. A production assistant met them in the hall, clipboard in hand, and stopped cold when she saw the dog. "Sir, I don't think animals are allowed on the—" "He's very quiet," Bruce said. He crouched, scratched Bodhi behind the ear. "He'll sit in the corner, you won't even know he's here." She hesitated, then waved them through. People usually did what Bruce asked. It wasn't force. It was something quieter than that, a steadiness. He looked at you like he already knew how the conversation was going to end and was just being polite about it. They put him in the green room to wait, and that's where the first strange thing happened. Badhai wouldn't lie down. The dog usually settled the second Bruce sat. Curled up, chin on paws, done for the night. Not tonight. Badhai stood in the middle of that little room with his ears pricked and a low sound rolling in his chest. Not a bark, just a hum, a warning idling in his throat. He stared at the door like something on the other side of it had a smell he didn't trust. Bruce noticed. Of course he noticed. He noticed everything. He watched his dog for a long moment, then looked at the door himself. "What is it?" he said quietly. Not really a question. He put one hand flat on Badhai's back and felt the muscles there, tight as ship rope. The dog knew something. And Bruce had lived long enough to know that when Badhai got like this, you paid attention. A dog can't lie to you. A dog doesn't know how. Out in the hall, Draska was pacing. Kellerman found him there, slapped him on the shoulder, and ran through it one more time. "You come out during the demo," Kellerman said. "I'll cue you. You get in his face, push him around a little. And when he freezes up, you let the whole country see it. That's the bit. That's the whole thing." Draska nodded, but he was barely listening. He'd already seen Bruce come in, seen how small the guy was, $135 maybe. And something ugly turned over inside Draska, the same thing that turned over in bars right before the furniture started breaking. He didn't just want to scare this guy for the cameras. He wanted to hurt him, for real, because he could. Because he was big and the other man was not, and that had always been reason enough for men like Draska. Kellerman didn't see that. Kellerman only saw good television, but the dog saw it. From behind that green room door, the dog saw all of it. And the low hum in Badhai's chest never stopped, not once, all the way up until the lights came on and a stagehand knocked and said, "Mr. Lee, you're on in 2." The band played Kellerman in at 11 o'clock sharp, applause sign flashing, studio audience clapping on cue. Kellerman came out in a sharp suit with that wide white smile and did 5 minutes of jokes about the mayor and the weather and his own bad marriage. The crowd loved him. He was good at this part. Nobody could take that from him. Then he settled behind his desk and leaned into the camera. "Now, folks," he said, "we've got a real treat tonight. A young man who says he can beat any fella in this room using nothing but his hands and his feet. They call it Kung Fu. I call it a good way to get your clock cleaned." Laughter. "Let's find out. Please welcome, all the way from Chinatown, Mr. Bruce Lee." Bruce walked out to polite, uncertain applause. He wore a plain dark shirt, black slacks, soft shoes. He looked calm. He shook Kellerman's hand, sat in the guest chair, and folded his hands in his lap. And behind him, padding out silent as a shadow, came Badhai. The dog walked to the edge of the stage lights, sat down on his haunches, and fixed his eyes on the dark wings of the studio where a very large man was waiting. Kellerman blinked at the dog, then decided to make it part of the act. "You bring your own bodyguard, son." "He goes where I go," Bruce said, small smile. "He won't bother anyone." "Well, he's welcome as long as he's housebroken." Big laugh from the crowd. Kellerman was rolling now. "So tell me, Bruce, all this Kung Fu, it's for the movies, right? It's for show. You wouldn't actually use it on a real man, a big man." "I hope I never have to use it on anyone," Bruce said. "That is the point of learning it well. A man who truly knows how to fight does not want to." That answer was too calm for Kellerman's taste, too smart. It made the host look slow, and Kellerman felt it, and his smile tightened a half-inch. Time to move things along. "That's beautiful," he said. "Real philosophical. But talk is cheap, my friend. How about a little demonstration? Show these good people what you can do." Bruce nodded and stood. He'd been told there'd be a demonstration. He figured he'd break a board, throw a few strikes for the camera, sit back down. He rolled his shoulders once and stepped to the open floor. Badhai's ears went flat, and that was when Kellerman gave the cue. "You know," Kellerman said, casual as anything, I don't think boards really prove much. A board doesn't hit back. What you need is a real opponent, somebody who won't go easy on you." He turned toward the wings and raised his voice. "Vince, come on out here." The floor started shaking before anyone saw him. Then Draska stepped into the light and the whole audience made one sound together, a low ooh, half fear and half delight. He was enormous. He'd stripped down to a tank top so everyone could see the arms. He walked straight up to Bruce, stopped a foot away, and looked down at him the way you'd look at something on the bottom of your shoe. "This the Karate Man," Draska said, "this little thing." Kellerman was grinning like a kid on Christmas. This was the bit, this was the gold. "Go on, Bruce," he called. "Show us, defend yourself." Bruce didn't move. He looked up at Draska, read his eyes, and understood the whole thing in about 1 second flat. The setup, the ambush, the joke he was supposed to be, and you could see something cross his face. Not fear, something more like disappointment. He'd come here in good faith. He'd walked into a trap. "I'm not going to fight this man," Bruce said, loud enough for the mics. "This isn't what I came for." The crowd booed, thinking he was scared. Kellerman spread his hands, playing to them. "Come on, tough guy, all that talk about the hands and the feet. Where'd it go?" And Draska, sensing weakness, sensing his moment, reached out with one massive hand and shoved Bruce in the chest. Except Bruce wasn't there anymore. He'd shifted just a few inches and Draska's shove pushed through empty air and threw the big man off his balance. Draska stumbled a step, caught himself, red-faced. The crowd laughed, and this time they were laughing at the giant. Draska's eyes went dark. He swung a big open slap. Bruce ducked it easily, tapped the man twice on the ribs, light as a knock on a door, and stepped back out of range. "Not a real strike, just a message. I could have hurt you 3 times already. I'm choosing not to." The audience roared. This was better than Kellerman's bit. This was David making a fool of Goliath. Kellerman felt the room turning and scrambled to catch up, laughing along, pretending it was all planned. All right," he said, clapping. "Not bad, kid, not bad at all. Vince, take a breather. Let's give these 2 a hand." And just like that, it seemed to be over. Draska backed off, chest heaving, glaring but still. Bruce straightened his shirt, walked back to the guest chair and sat down. The tension bled out of the room. People settled. Somebody handed Bruce a glass of water and he took a slow sip. Badhai's ears came up a fraction, but the dog stayed sitting. Kellerman shuffled his cards, ready to move to the next segment. The band played a little sting. The crowd exhaled all at once, the way a crowd does when the scary part's finished and everybody gets to relax. Everybody except the dog. Because the man who'd been made a fool of on national television was still standing at the edge of the lights, and he was not letting go of it. Draska didn't walk off stage. He stood there in the wings with the laughter still ringing in his ears, and something inside him snapped clean in half. He'd been humiliated, made small, by a man half his size in front of the whole country. And Vince Draska had spent his entire life making sure nobody ever made him feel small. He wasn't thinking about the $200 anymore. He wasn't thinking about the bit. He reached into his boot where he kept a thing he was never supposed to bring, and his fingers closed around cold metal. Then he came back out, fast, and this time there was no grin. "Vince," Kellerman started, half rising from his desk. "Vince, we're done, we're..." Draska didn't hear him. He crossed the stage in 3 heavy strides, and now everyone could see the flash of steel over his knuckles. Brass. Real brass knuckles on a fist the size of a canned ham. This wasn't a bit anymore. This was a man who meant to put another man in the hospital, live, in front of a studio audience and every home in Los Angeles. Badhai came off the floor like a coiled spring, up on all 4 feet, and let out a bark that cracked across the studio like a gunshot. And this is where everything changed. Because now it wasn't about pride. It wasn't a joke that got out of hand. This was survival. Bruce could see the brass on the man's hand, could see the intent behind the eyes, and he understood in a heartbeat that the next 30 seconds were about whether he walked out of that building on his own 2 feet. The whole nature of the night had flipped. Kellerman had wanted a laugh. What he'd unleashed was a 350-pound man trying to kill somebody on his stage. Bruce was still sitting in the guest chair when Draska reached him. There was no time to stand up properly, so Bruce didn't. He rolled sideways out of the chair as the brass-knuckled fist came down and smashed the chair to splinters where his head had been. Wood cracked. A woman in the front row screamed and grabbed her husband. The chair legs skittered across the floor. Bruce came up in a low crouch, hands open, and for the first time all night his face had gone completely blank. No smile, no disappointment, just work. Now, before I tell you exactly what he did to that man, I want to say one thing. If you've made it this far, and you're feeling that thing in your chest right now, that lean in, that need to know how it ends, that's the whole reason I do this. So if you're still with me, do me one favor and hit that subscribe button. It costs you nothing and it tells me you want more stories like this one. All right, back to the stage, because it's about to get very fast. Draska pulled the ruined chair leg free and swung it like a club, aiming for Bruce's skull. Bruce didn't back up. He stepped in. That's the thing people never understand about a man like Bruce Lee. The safest place to be against a bigger man is closer, not farther, because a giant needs room to bring his weight to bear, and Bruce took that room away. He got inside the swing, jammed the man's arm before it could build power, and drove the heel of his palm up under Draska's chin. Draska's head snapped back. His teeth clacked. The club fell from his hand and clattered to the boards. And the crowd, which had been screaming a second ago, went suddenly, strangely quiet because they could feel that the game had turned again, and this time it had turned all the way over. Kellerman was on his feet behind the desk now, waving at somebody in the booth, mouthing cut to commercial, cut, cut. But nobody in the booth cut. You know why? Because whatever was happening on that stage was the best thing that had ever gone out over that channel, and some part of everyone in that control room knew you don't cut away from history. So the red light stayed on, and the whole thing went out live. Draska shook off the palm strike. He was hurt, he was dizzy, but he was 350 pounds and he was enraged, and a man that big can absorb a lot before he goes down. He lowered his shoulder and charged, arms wide, trying to wrap Bruce up and crush him against the wall, put all that weight to use. This was the charge you saw at the very start, the floor shaking, the boots on the boards, the whole studio holding its breath. And Bruce did the thing that nobody in that room would ever forget. He waited. He waited until the very last possible instant, until Draska was fully committed, all that weight rushing forward with nowhere to go. Then Bruce dropped, pivoted on one foot, caught the man's outstretched arm, and used Draska's own momentum against him. 350 pounds went up and over and down. The whole building shook when Draska hit the stage. And before the big man could even understand what had happened, Bruce had that arm locked, bent up behind the man's back at an angle arms are not built to hold, one knee pinning him to the boards. Draska bellowed. He heaved and thrashed with everything he had, and he could not move an inch. That's the part people couldn't believe. The little man had the giant completely helpless, not by being stronger, by being smarter and faster, and by understanding leverage the way other men understand breathing. Draska's face was mashed against the stage floor, and every time he strained against the lock, a fresh bolt of pain shot through his shoulder, and he learned very quickly to stop straining. "Drop it," Bruce said quietly. The brass knuckles were still on the man's other fist. "Drop it now." Draska held on out of pure stubbornness. Bruce applied a fraction more pressure, just a fraction, and the brass knuckles hit the floor with a clank. Bruce kicked them away, out of reach, all without letting go of the lock, And here's where Bodhi comes back into it. The dog had held his ground the whole time because Bruce had trained him to wait, to never act until it was truly needed. But now Bodhi walked slowly across the stage, right up to the pinned giant's face, and stood there. He didn't bite. He didn't even growl. He just stood there, inches away, and looked into Draska's eyes with those dark, patient eyes of his, as if to say, "You should not have done that." And Draska, who had never been afraid of anything in his adult life, stopped struggling entirely. He lay still on that stage floor with a 135-pound man holding his arm and a German shepherd staring into his soul, and something went out of him for good. The studio was dead silent. You could hear the buzz of the stage lights. You could hear Draska breathing. Nobody clapped. Nobody laughed. Nobody made a sound. Bruce held the lock a moment longer until he was sure it was over. Then he let go and stood up in one smooth motion, stepping back out of range in case the big man tried something. But Draska didn't try anything. He rolled onto his side, cradling his arm, and he stayed down. He wasn't badly hurt. Bruce had made very sure of that, even in the middle of it. A man who truly knows how to fight controls exactly how much damage he does. Draska would have a sore shoulder and a bruised ego and nothing worse, but he would never, as long as he lived, look at a small man the same way again. Bruce turned toward the audience, and he wasn't breathing hard. That was the thing that unsettled people most when they talked about it later. He'd just thrown a giant across a stage and pinned him helpless, and he stood there as calm as if he'd gotten up to answer the phone. He looked out at all those frozen faces. Then he looked at Kellerman, who was standing behind his desk white as a sheet, with his mouth hanging open. "This is not a game," Bruce said. His voice carried in the silence. He wasn't angry. That was almost worse. He was just telling the truth. "You brought a man out here to hurt me for a laugh. He came with a weapon. Someone could have died on your stage tonight, and you would have called it entertainment." Kellerman opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Bruce clicked his tongue softly. Bodhi trotted to his side and sat, leaning against his leg. Bruce put one hand down on the dog's head, and then he did the last thing anyone expected. He walked over to where Draska lay on the floor, and he crouched down and he offered the big man his hand. Draska stared at it. This little man he tried to kill 30 seconds ago was helping him up. For a long moment Draska didn't move. Then slowly, he reached out and took the offered hand, and Bruce helped him to his feet. The giant towered over him again, same as before, but it meant nothing now. Everyone had seen the truth of it. Size was just size. It wasn't the same thing as power. "You're fast," Draska muttered. It was the closest thing to an apology a man like that knew how to give. "And you're strong," Bruce said. "Strength is a good thing, it just needs the right master." He patted the man's enormous forearm once, then turned and walked off the stage, the dog at his heel, and he did not look back at Barry Kellerman even once. The audience found its voice then. It started with one person clapping somewhere in the back, and then it swept the whole room and it became a roar and people were on their feet and it went on and on. But they weren't cheering for the show. They were cheering for the man who just walked out the door. Kellerman stood in the middle of all that noise and understood finally that none of it was for him. The show never came back from the break. They ran a rerun for the rest of the hour. And by the time the studio emptied out that night, the story was already moving through the city faster than any wire could carry it. People who'd watched it live called their friends, told them what they'd seen. A giant thrown across a stage. A dog that stood guard. A young man who could have crippled his attacker and chose instead to lift him up off the floor. The network executives had been watching from their offices. They'd seen the brass knuckles. They'd seen a man nearly killed on their live broadcast, on a stunt their own host had arranged and paid for with cash. And they were not thinking about ratings anymore. They were thinking about lawyers, about liability, about what happens to a company when it puts a weapon in a man's hand on live television. By 1 in the morning, before Kellerman had even left the building, the decision was made. Kellerman After Dark was finished, canceled, effective immediately. There would be no next episode. They told Kellerman in his own office. He sat behind his desk with a drink he wasn't drinking and listened to a man in a gray suit explain, very calmly, that his contract was being terminated for cause, that the network would not be associated with what had happened, and that it might be best for everyone if Bari didn't speak to the press. Kellerman nodded through all of it. What was there to say? He'd built the whole thing himself. He'd wanted to make a small man look small, and instead he'd shown the entire country exactly how big a man could be. He'd handed his own show a loaded moment, and it had gone off in his hand. Here's the part that stings the most, and it's true. Kellerman never worked in television again. Not really. He did some radio in a smaller market for a while. He tried to sell a book that nobody bought. Every door in the business he'd spent 20 years climbing was suddenly, quietly closed. Because the story followed him. Nobody wanted to hire the man who'd nearly gotten someone killed for a joke. The very cruelty that had made his show popular turned out to be the thing that ended him, the second it met somebody it couldn't push around. Draska, believe it or not, came out of it better than Kellerman did. The papers could have made him a monster. Instead, people kept talking about that handshake, about the little man helping the giant up off the floor, and something about being on the receiving end of that mercy changed Vince Draska. He gave up the bar fights. He got work as a bouncer at a place where his job was mostly to keep the peace by standing in a doorway, and he was good at it, because now he knew the difference between being feared and being respected. Years later, an interviewer asked him about that night, about the toughest man he'd ever gone up against. And Draska, who'd wrestled heavyweights his whole life, didn't even hesitate. 135 pounds, he said. Fastest hands God ever made. And you know what got me? He didn't want to hurt me. He could have broke my arm clean off and nobody would have blamed him. He didn't. That's the part I still think about. As for Bruce, he didn't say much about it at all. He went home that night the same way he'd come, out the back, the dog padding along beside him. Badhai finally settled once they were in the car, curled up on the seat, chin on paws, the danger gone. Bruce drove the quiet streets home and didn't turn the radio on. He wasn't proud of himself. He didn't take it as a victory. To him, it was a sad thing when it came down to it. A man had been paid to hurt him for a laugh, and it had all gone the way it always goes when cruelty runs into something it can't move. He'd have rather done the demonstration, broken a board, shaken some hands, gone home without any of it. But you remember what he told Kellerman early on before any of it happened. A man who truly knows how to fight does not want to. That was the whole thing right there. The power was never in the throw or the lock or the speed of his hands. The power was in the choice. Draska had all the size in the world and no control over any of it. Kellerman had a national platform and used it to make people smaller. And 135-pound man walked into their trap, took everything they threw at him, and then reached down and helped his attacker to his feet. That's what the whole country saw that night. Not a fight. A demonstration, after all, just not the one anybody was expecting. And that dog, that good dog knew before anyone. Knew from behind a closed door that something in that building meant harm. Stood guard the whole night through and never bit a soul because his master never needed him to. When people told the story afterward, and they told it for years, they always mentioned the dog. The shepherd who walked up to a downed giant and simply looked at him. Sometimes the truest strength in a room makes no noise at all. It just stands there steady and waits to be needed. The show went dark that night and never came back. And somewhere across town, a young man let himself into a quiet house, filled a bowl of water for his dog, and went to bed without a word about the thing he'd done. That was Bruce Lee. That was who he was when the cameras weren't even trying to catch it.